Hello ladies and gentlemen, my name is Mike Smith and today we're going to create a Blender 2.9 node-based procedural texture that makes scales. I had wanted to do a project where I had a fish, and I looked around online and most of the tutorials were using an image to create the texture, which I didn't particularly want to do. And the ones that were procedural, there weren't that many and most of them weren't very good. And then the one that was pretty good had two big problems. One was it was a very long video, but explicitly didn't explain why it was doing anything. So there were a lot of nodes, none of them were explained, a lot of magic values, didn't understand why. And two, it was all in service of putting them on a I'm going to do two things differently. One, I'm going to explain what I'm doing, and I'll share the Blender, and I'll put notes in, and I'll make it nice and clean. And two, apologies, I'm not going to put it on a so another thing, if you find this video useful, and I hope you do, I don't really do this, you don't have to like, you don't have to subscribe, and I'm not funded by anyone, but if you wanted to check out wren.co, W-R-E-N.co, they have a whole lot of cool strategies to help you reduce your carbon footprint, which is one thing I think is important, and I think they do it interestingly, so if that's something you're into, go ahead and take a look. So without further ado, we're going to split this into two sections. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to have a video that really just shows you, one, how do we create a shape? We're not going to create a scale shape yet. We'll just create like a circle. How do I lay it out in rows? And then how do I offset one of those rows, like scales, right? Where there's like a scale and then the next row is in between the scales above. I guess I'll put a picture here somewhere. And then finally, we need the scales that are on the top to overlap the scales that are on the bottom, etc., all the way down. So I'm going to show you how to do all of that with just a simple shape. And then the second one is actually going to go into making the scale and making it the right shape and putting colors and textures and all that good stuff on it. So let's get started. First, let's get rid of the default cube. And now what we're going to do, we're going to go over here and add a plane. I'm going to go to the shading tab and look at it from the top. Okay, and now I'm going to create a new node-based material. I am assuming that you know how to do all the things I just did here. If not, I'll recommend some basic tutorials that you can start with. If you got this far though, let's get at it. So the first thing we're going to do is add an input. For the purpose of this tutorial, I'm going to use the UV mapping because I've unwrapped it to specifically work the way I want it to. Let me briefly explain what these coordinates are. So right now what we're going to do is plug this UV directly into the color. And what this is going to do, it outputs a vector with three values, x, y, and z. In this case, z isn't doing anything, it's just x and y. And this is going to be represented as colors the same way actually on these axes up in the top right corner. So what you're going to see is that it prints out the color for the coordinate on this texture. So at the bottom left, where the coordinates are 0, 0, so 0 y, which would go this way, again like your axes, and 0 x, which would go this way, you see a little black dot. Maybe that's not obvious, so let me zoom in so you can see it's black. Along the left edge, there's no red at all because we're only going up in y, so this is getting more green as you go. And along the x edge, there's no green, so it goes up in red as you go. And then they mix together into yellow through the middle. So if you get your texture, this is what you're getting. Okay, so that's the basic texture. The second thing we're going to want to do is have some sort of shape. Eventually, obviously, it'll be a scale shape. I'm not going to start there. That we want to tessellate like scales. So where we're going with this is we're going to want rows going from left to right and top to bottom of scales, and we want the scales to overlap. So we want the first row to be on top, then we want a row under it that's beneath the top row and adjusted to the right so that it's in the middle, and then we're going to adjust back to the left and go under that row and keep doing that texture as you go down like scales do. So the first step there is we're going to make a object that we can just iterate on in that way, and I'm going to do a circle. So how do you create a circle? Arendelle does really great basic procedural texture tutorials. I will link to one if you want to get into a whole bunch of different shapes you can do. For these purposes, I'm just going to do a circle, which is very easy. So to do a circle, you may remember, or you may not, a circle is all points that are equal to or less than a distance from the center. So if the center is 0, what we want to do is create a function where it is 1 when it's less than some distance from 0, 0, and 0 when it's farther away. So the way we're going to do that is we're going to go to add, we're going to go to converter, we're going to go to vector math, and vector math very conveniently has a distance. So we're going to go here to distance, and by default it's distance from 0. So If I just throw that in, what you're going to see is now we don't have colors because it's just a single value from 0 to 1 in this case. And what it's saying is it's 0 at 0, 0, right? Because the distance is 0. And then as you get farther away, the distance gets higher. But we're not really getting a circle. So the way that we're going to get a circle is we're going to do add, converter. Now we're doing math because it's a single value, not a vector value. And we're going to do less than. So now we're going to find everything. So if I do less than 0.5, now I've got a circle. The final step of this, of course, is that I've only got a quarter of the circle because the 0, 0 point is in the bottom left and I want it actually in the center. So what I'm going to do there is shift the coordinates. So if you remember from back at the beginning, right now the coordinates are 0, 0 at the bottom corner. So let's get them in the center. So the way we're going to do that is we're just going to add, converter, vector math, vector add. And we're just going to subtract 5 from the x to move it over to the right, subtract 5 from the y to move it up. So effectively what's happening is that the UV coordinates now start at -5, -0.5, -0.5, and go up to +0.5, 0.5. And you can see in this scenario, because Blender doesn't show negative numbers as anything other than black, everything that's less than 0 is over here. Everything where the x value is less than 0 is only green, and everything where the y value is less than 0 is only red, and then we have that old square we had here. Okay, so what's that going to do? Well, if we plug this into our circle, now instead of measuring to this bottom left corner, we're going to be measuring, we're going to be measuring to the center of the picture. So let me connect that, and this, boom, circle. Okay, of course I could also just change what point I'm deciding to make the center, so I could have adjusted what I'm measuring the distance from. But I think this is going to work out better, as you'll see later. So now we have a circle. Okay, so what we want to do is create a scale-like pattern with these circles, and then actually create a scale-like shape, and then add a bunch of textures and other stuff to it. So now that we've got a circle, the first thing we want to do is create a set of rows of this circle. So we're going to do two operations. The first is we're going to figure out how to make a bunch of rows of the same circle, as a pattern, and the second thing we're going to do is figure out how to offset some of those rows so that they're in between each other. So let's just start with the rows. So if we go back to our coordinate system, if we wanted to repeat our circle, what we want to do is basically repeat exactly this pattern with a center going from -0.5, -0.5 to +0.5, +0.5, and we want to repeat that over and over in a table-like pattern with rows and columns. So what we want to do here, right now, when you take this set of coordinates, it starts at -0.5, -0.5, and just keeps going this way forever. So you can't tell at the moment because we haven't fit any more in, but what we're going to do is scale it. So we're going to go to add, converter, vector math again, drop it in here, and now we're going to go to scale. And effectively what we're going to do is the original UV coordinates went from 0 to 1, and then we offset them. Now what we're going to do is multiply it by some number like 10, so, or probably that's too much, let's say 3. So now instead of going from 0 to 1, it's going to go from 0 to 3. So we multiply that by 3, and what you can see here is that we have 1, 0, 0, here, let's do it without adding. So if I didn't offset it at all, right, we've got 0, 0 in the bottom left corner, and it just keeps going all the way to 3 up here. It doesn't repeat. So what we wanted to do is repeat. Now you may remember from math that there's something called modulo, and that's what we're going to use. I'll explain it in a second. So we're going to go to add, go to converter, go to vector math, drop it in here, and what we're going to do is use modulo. So what modulo does is it gives you, gives you just the remainder. So in other words, if I divide each value in the first vector by each value in the second vector, it's going to give me the remainder. So if I divide by 0, you may not remember, that doesn't make any sense, so it just gives me black. But let's say I want these repeating sections to be 1 by 1. So if I do this, what it's going to do, now you see we have 3 of them, is it's going to start here, and it's going to climb up to 1. And then when it starts at 1, the modulo will cut off the 1 and just do the remainder. So it starts back at 1.0, so 0, and then goes up now to 1 again. Now the underlying UV goes to 2. Again, it strips off the 2 and just does the remainder. And we can fiddle with this. I've chosen to do modulo 1, but you don't have to. We could do modulo 0.5, for instance. And then for every 1, it would repeat itself twice. So there you go. So to do a table, that's all we're going to do. We're going to turn this into a reusable node group and actually add a few more features to it. But that's the basic function. So the second thing about this is that for the purposes of what we're doing, and this is similar to the way like Voronoi texture does it. If you use that, we want to provide the origin for this, right? We've got this repeating pattern from 0 to 1. We want it to be in the middle, not at the bottom corner. So we're just going to do the same thing we did last time and chuck this on the front of it. So we're going to add, in this case, half of the width and height, right? Which will put us to the center. So as you can see, if I do that, now they're in the center. So if I didn't do this, you can see, as I move back towards 0, we go back to the origin. Okay. There we go. So the other thing which I mentioned is we really do want this to be half of the value of this size. And the reason is, let's say we're using this and we start fiddling around with the dimension, the center's not moving, and that's really annoying. So what we're going to do is we're going to do add converter combine XYZ, which is a way to create a vector that we can reuse. And we're going to do, this will be our dimensions, 1 by 1. And now we're going to do this. And then instead of adding in minus 0.5, minus 0.5, what we're going to do is scale this value by negative, scale this value by negative 0.5. So basically have this and make it negative, and then add that in. So we're going to do that now. Add converter, again, vector math, go to scale, which is just multiply everything in the vector by whatever the value is. And we're going to make it minus 0.5, which is basically going to create exactly the same vector we already had and add it in there. But now, if I adjust these, it stays in the center. Okay, so that's all we're going to do for the moment. What I'm going to do, and if we plug this into the circles, just so you can see them repeated nicely. Boom. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to turn this into a node group so we can reuse it. Node groups are a really nice way to, one, like clean up your node. These things can get really complicated and hard to follow. And then also try not to repeat yourself. There's a term in the coding world called being dry. Do not repeat yourself, which is common. And so if you find yourself recreating the same set of nodes over and over, rather than repeating them, where when you want to make changes or you might make subtle mistakes in one place and not realize it, you should do it once and just reuse it. And node groups let you do that. So the way we're going to create a node group is we're going to select all the bits we use to make a table, a set of rows and columns. And we're going to now press Control G, and that creates a node group. One of the annoying things that it does is even though we're only bringing in one value for some of these things, it repeats them. So it splits it into 2 for some reason. I don't know why it does that. So this should have 2 inputs instead of 1. But what we're going to do is go ahead and rename these so it's clear what these are. So within a lot of what you're going to do, vector is what they usually call the UV. So we're just going to leave the UV as vector. But then we're going to call this one dimensions for the X and Y. And then this is just a repeat of dimensions. So we're going to get rid of it. And then we're going to plug it in here. And then the output, again, is just going to be vector. So this is your new vector having fed it in. So one of the things that used to confuse me, I'll just point out rather than doing it quickly here, was once you got in one of these node groups, how do you navigate in and out of them? So once you're in the node group, you can see the document you're working on is hidden behind here. You go over here to this little up arrow, you click on that, and now you're out. If you want to go back in, you find your node group, and you click on this little thing in the top right, this little icon here, and you're back in. So out, in. Okay, so we're going to go out, and we're going to call this guy create rows, and it takes a vector in, whatever your coordinate system is, and dimensions, and then repeats it in a table like this. Okay, so now that we've got rows, the next thing we're going to want to do is create 2 of them, right? And offset them, importantly. So the way we're going to do that is we're just going to reuse this create rows. So I'm going to click on create rows, and now to copy something you already have, you just say Shift D. I get a second copy. Okay, so now what we're going to do is we're going to use the same dimensions for both of them. So this can be the same. And we're going to use the same vector to start with. But now what we want to do is we want to offset this row. So right now, if I put this in here, it's in exactly the same place. So what we're going to do is we have these two rows. We want to offset them. To make that a little easier to see, what I'm going to do is go ahead and make two sets of circles. And we'll make a node group for these in a minute. And I'm going to make them different colors. And then we'll combine them back together so you can actually see them. So what we're going to do here is we're going to make two sets of circles. In fact, I should have just made them a node group. Maybe I'll edit that out. Let's just select these, create node group. We'll call it circle. This is going to be dimension. Oh, one of the things I didn't mention, if you don't see this, it's because it's over here. You have to click on that little button to see these inputs and then on group. And I'm going to change the threshold here to radius. Oops. And now we have a reusable circle. So we're going to pop out of there, call that circle. And now I'm going to create two of them. So I select it, press Shift D, I put my second set of coordinates in. Okay, so how do I combine these two? Because they're only black and white for the moment, what we're going to do is do add converter math, and we're going to put maximum in here. So what this is going to do is it's going to look at the two values it has, and whatever the maximum of the two is what it's going to paint. Right now, the circles are overlapping with each other, so all the white just lays on top of each other and you don't see anything. But as we start splitting it apart, you're going to see some are offset now. So, okay, so now what we're going to do is offset some of the circles. So the way we're going to do that is we're going to take this incoming coordinate system and we're just going to offset it. So add converter vector math. And we're going to go ahead and add 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So you can see it's now moving to the left. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 down. And so we're moving half a row up and half a row down, half a column down, I guess. So the problem now is that these are too big. So let's go ahead and change the radius on these. And I've done something else. What have I done here? Oh, I made x 1.5 earlier for demonstration purposes. Okay, there we go. And we get polka dots. So that's pretty cool. The next thing we're going to do is go ahead and make them different colors so you can tell which row is which. So we're going to make one red and one green. Okay, so we've made a row of a shape. We've now made two rows of a shape and we've offset them. Now we're going to make them colors because the next thing we actually want them to do is overlap. And we want them to overlap in a specific way, right? When we make scales, these scales are on top of those scales, which are on top of these scales. So we don't want like all these rows to always be on top, and we don't want all these rows to always be on top. We specifically want the higher rows to be on top of the lower rows, and I'm going to show you how to do that in a minute. So to show that, first I'm going to make these different colors. So let's get rid of this. So now we're going, because we're going to have them as colors, we're going to add color mix RGB. We're going to add this one, we're going to add that one, and we're going to do lighten. So this is basically going to take one and lighten the other, and you'll see how that works in a second, and I'm going to do 100% lighten. So if either of them has a color, we should see them. If both of them have a color right now, they're going to generate a mixture of the two. So let's plug that in. Very exciting, same picture we had before. Okay, so now we need to convert them to an actual color. So I'm going to add color. I'm going to do mix RGB again. Now I'm just going to do mix. So what I'm going to do is plug this into factor. So this is between black and white, 0 and 1. So when it's 0, this mix is going to, when you put factor to 0, let me show you quickly. We're going to make this one black. And let's say this one we want to make red. Okay, so as the factor moves, it gets more red to the right and more black to the left. So when we plug this output in, oh, I called it radius. That should be vector. That was when I changed the other one. Okay, let me fix that quickly. Or actually, I guess we should call this maybe mask, because it's 1 when it's in the circle and 0 when it's out. Okay, So that's a bit clearer. All right, great. So we put the mask in. So when it's 1, it's red. When it's 0, it's black. Now we have a color. Click on this, Shift D, put it over top of this connector, and we're going to do the same thing, mask, except instead of red, let's make it green. Okay, great, we have red and green. So now what you're going to see, let's go ahead and make the radiuses a bit bigger, and let's start shrinking the amount of space that they have, the dimensions, so that they overlap. So let's overlap them on Y here and make... Okay, so this is wrong. So this isn't going to be scales, right? What we want is we want these circles to be on top and these completely removed where they overlap. And then we want these to be on top and those completely removed where they overlap. So how do we do that? So what we're going to do here, and this, I may be using a confusing term here because I'm bringing this from video game graphics, but and in Blender, we have the same term meaning maybe different things. But in terms of 2D graphics, often there's this concept of what's called Z-buffering, and the idea is for every pixel on the screen where you have multiple values you might show, you give it a Z value. Now, in Blender, we're actually 3D, and I'm not actually changing its Z value, so I'm not doing that. But I'm basically adding another bit of information that says how high is it in terms of what order to render these things. So what I want to do is come up with some logic that lets me say that the first row is higher than the second row is higher than the third row. And the way I'm going to do that is that if you look at these rows, the Y value of the center of each of these circles is higher for the things that I want to have on top, right? So Y is 0 down here. It's 3, I guess, with our scaling up at the top. And what I want is I want the things with the higher Y value to be on top. That way the top row is on top of the second row, on top of the third row, etc. So the way I'm going to do that, I need to update my rows so that they actually give me the position of the middle of each one of these guys, and then I need to compare them. So let's do those two things. So I'm going to go back to my create rows. I'm going to click on this little icon in the top corner, and I'm going to go ahead and now fiddle with these so that they give me a position. Okay, so what I want to do, I want to take the incoming coordinate system. So this is continuous, right? 0 to 3 in this case. And the first thing I want to do is find the bottom left corner of this square. And the way I'm going to do that is take this value and I'm going to subtract the modulo. So if you remember, what the modulo does is it removes the whole number in this case, because we're modulo 1 at the moment, and just gives me the remainder. What I want to do is get rid of the remainder and keep the whole one. So what I'm going to do is do add, converter, vector math, and I'm going to do subtract this time, if I can find it. And I'm going to subtract the modulo from the coordinates. So now I've got the bottom left corner. Now I want the center of this. I don't want the bottom left corner, although I guess that would work too, but just for consistency with the way we've done the coordinate system. So now what I need to do is I need to offset it by half the dimensions. Well, again, we have minus half the dimensions. So what I'm going to do, just to make this slightly less confusing, I'm going to make this divided by 2 instead of negative 2. Instead of add, I'm going to make this subtract. Oh, 2, not 5. Oh, 0.5. I'm sorry, not divided by 2. Here we go. Okay, sorry. So I'm going to divide, previously I was effectively dividing by negative 2. Now what I'm doing is just having the dimensions and then subtracting them to get the coordinate system. Well, I'm just going to do the same thing. I've now got the bottom left. Now I want to add instead of subtract is why I did this, and I think this is clear. So I'm going to add a converter, and I'm going to add vector math. And now I'm just going to add the bottom left corner to half the width and height. And that's going to give me the position of the center of this. So no matter where I am, no matter where this continuous value is within a cell, I'm going to get the value of the center of the circle. So I'm going to put that in, and to be consistent with other textures within Blender, I'm going to call that pause. So this is what pause is in Voronoi. Voronoi? I don't know how it's pronounced. Anyway, the Voronoi texture, if you've used that before. Okay, so now I have a position. So the second thing I need to do is I need to fix this position. So if I do it right now, this position is wrong. And the reason is that from inside create rows, I've offset the coordinate system by adding in 0.5. So, and it doesn't know that, right? When it gets, for instance, what would be 0, instead what it gets is 0.5. And so this position is in terms of this shifted set of coordinates. So I need to unshift them. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to duplicate this, and I'm just going to subtract from the outgoing position exactly the thing I added in over here. And so this is the position of the second one. Okay, so that's a lot of stuff. Now what? Okay, so now what I need to do is I'm going to use these two positions and these two masks for the circle. And the logic that I want is basically to say, if the mask applies, so if this is something I'm actually drawing for this first guy, this first row, right? Then what I want to do is see if the other one is also trying to draw, and this one has a higher y value, it's farther up, then I want to draw this one. And if it has a lower value, then I want to draw the other one. So how am I going to do that? Well, let me move these colors out of the way. We're going to do the logic first, and then we'll plug it into the colors. So basically what we want to do is take the height. So let's do add, converter, separate x, y, z. So we're going to separate x, y, z, and let's put it, I don't know, here. We're going to put in pause, and now we can take out the y, and we're going to do the same thing here. So here, we're going to take this corrected vector, and we're going to shift D, duplicate the subtract, or sorry, separate, and we're just going to separate x, y, and z. Okay, so now we have our height. If I can get this to connect. There we go. We have our heights. So I have the height of this row up here, I have the height of that row down here. And now what I want to do is I only want to compare the heights. I only want the height to matter when the circle is actually being drawn. So I'm going to do add, converter, math, and I'm going to multiply them, right? So this mask is 1 when I'm drawing the circle and 0 when I'm not. If I take that and I multiply it by the height, what I'm going to get out is a height only when the mask applies, only when I'm drawing the circle, and otherwise a 0. And then I'm just going to do the same thing for the other one. So, and you may be noticing I'm repeating myself, and we should make a component, which we will later. Okay, so, oh, sorry, not add, multiply. Okay, so now what we have is a height value, if you will, or a priority value, if you want to think of it that way, the y, for this first row only when it's actually drawing a circle, and the same thing for the other one. And so now what we want to say is I want to create a mask that will only apply when this is actually being drawn and it's higher than the second row. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a converter, math, greater than, and I'm going to say when the top row value is greater than the lower row value, then we actually want to draw it. So this is the mask. So just to walk through that, we've got our two rows. From each row, we pull out the y coordinate, which is how we're deciding which is higher in priority, if you want to think of it that way. We've also got our mask for the circle. So we multiply the height by the mask, so it's the value of height for that row, value of y, sorry, for that row when you're drawing the circle, 0 otherwise, for both of these. And then I'm just saying, is this one higher? So if this one is not being drawn, then it's 0, so it doesn't matter. If it is being drawn, it's the value of the row, the y value of the row. Same for this one. If it's not being drawn, we don't care, so it's just 0. If they're both being drawn, this will be the value of the height of this one. And this will compare the two and figure out which one is higher. So if only one of them is being drawn, then that one's going to be higher because the other one's 0. And if they're both being drawn, then it's going to return the higher one, and that's going to come out here as a 1 when the first row is higher and a 0 when the lower row is higher. Whew. Okay, so now what we're going to do is we can use that the same way we use the mask into a mixRBG. So we're going to go ahead and add color mixRBG, and we're going to say, okay, so when this is 1, we want to put in the top row. So the top row is the green row, or sorry, the top row is the red row. So we want to plug the red row into the value that we'll get when we put in 1, which is the bottom one, right? So as factor moves to the right, we're going to do that one. And then we want to, when it's 0, when it's not the top one, we want to plug it into the first one. And then we're going to use this as the factor. And then hopefully, if this works first try, let's see what we get. Voila! So there you have it. So this draws both rows and overlaps them so that the higher rows in terms of y value anyway are always on top of the lower rows in terms of y value. And you can already see this is going to help us start making our scale pattern. So this is tutorial 1. I hope it was useful. I'm going to share this Blender in the description, so if you want to see that, I'll put it there. I'll also link to some really basic tutorials. If you didn't understand sort of the basics of opening Blender and creating this object and what nodes is, I'll share some great videos on that. And then also, if you're interested in more complicated shapes and some of the founding I use it to figure out how to do this, Aaron Dale has really great videos. I'll link to his channel in the bottom. So that's it. Thank you very much.